All right, so it is about 10:04. We're ready to start. Welcome, everybody. We hope everybody's having a good Saturday morning. So Martesha Johnson is here, our public defender. Welcome. So we've been doing this for a number of weeks, and we have different people on, and we kind of just talk about, first of all, you know, kind of how things are going and what you do as a public defender. But there's a lot of very good questions on here today, and we'll get to those in just a second. I will tell you that Councilmember John Rutherford is on, and our County Clerk Brenda Wynn is on. So welcome, everybody. And let's see. I'm looking for my latest numbers. Latest numbers from this morning in terms of COVID-19, 7,986 confirmed cases. If I've got that right, that's an increase in 279 cases. That's not good. We have 90 deaths in Davidson County. So we're watching those numbers. Obviously, we're getting to phase 3, but those numbers keep going up. Just keeping a very close eye on that. All right, so Martesha, tell me a little bit about yourself. For those people who, I know who you are, and a lot of people know who you are, but a little bit about yourself, just in case people don't know who you are.
Well, I am born and raised right here in Nashville, my favorite city in the entire country, entire world. I went to Whites Creek High School, graduated from there, and went directly to Tennessee State University and then to UT Knoxville for law school. I have been a lawyer in the public defender's office for my entire career. So fresh out of law school, I started as a Nashville defender, and now 11 years later, I am the chief public defender. I also am an adjunct professor at Vanderbilt, where I teach trial advocacy. And my family is pretty spread out across the country. I have 2 children, and I just love life. I don't know what else you want to know. I also love people.
That's that's great. So so tell me a little bit, in case people don't fully understand what the public defender's office does. First of all, obviously it's here in Davidson County, the basic functions and how many attorneys you all have, and kind of how it works.
Sure. So the public defender is an agency of lawyers and support staff. So we have lawyers in both an adult division and a juvenile division. We also have supportive team members, investigators, social services team. We have, we call them client advocates. We have legal assistants, and basically we all work collaboratively as a team to defend people who have been charged with a crime, any level of crime, from the lowest level misdemeanor, which is a Class C misdemeanor, all the way up until your highest level of felony, which are your murders. We represent people all across that spectrum. If they cannot afford to hire an attorney of their own and there is no conflict in their case, then oftentimes we are appointed to represent people, and we represent them from arrest to trial. And we have an appellate division in which we represent people that we've represented at trial on their appeal to the higher courts. We have a staff of 95. We have 95 positions. I don't have all of them filled at the moment, but we have 47 lawyers, and the rest of our team is support staff, as I mentioned before.
Okay, so take people through kind of a maybe a typical day. So I used to remember the jail dockets and everything else like that. So in a typical day, how does the office work? I assume some people go to the jail, deal with that. You've also got trials going on and other things. Just a typical day in the life of the public defender's office.
So I will try to answer that question and break it up into the different functions.
Sure.
Because a typical day for a general sessions lawyer versus a criminal court lawyer versus a juvenile lawyer is different. And so a typical day for someone who is assigned in general sessions, which is the fast-paced place where all cases originate. Well, I should say most. There are a few cases that can bypass general sessions court and go directly to criminal court. In the general sessions, we have 11 judges who are working on a rotation basis to staff a variety of dockets, both jail dockets for people who are in custody and bond dockets for folks who have been released either because they paid a bail bondsman, or they paid a cash bond, or they were released pretrial, or some other form of release. And so we have a team of lawyers who are staffing every single one of those judges' dockets on a daily basis. And they are in the most fast-paced, ever-changing, I mean, their role changes pretty much daily. So a typical day for a general sessions lawyer is, one, what docket are you going to be working? If you are working a jail docket, then we have two levels of that. We have what is called an initial appearance docket for people who have been arrested within the past 24 hours. And then we have the other dockets where that takes a little bit more time. So if you're going to a jail docket and you are representing people who have been charged with the very lowest level misdemeanors, so B misdemeanor and C misdemeanors, you might be representing every single person on a docket that's been arrested in the past 24 hours and charged with one of those offenses. If you are assigned to our A misdemeanor jail docket, so those are cases that are a little more serious, they carry up to 11 months and 29 days in custody if you were convicted of a charge, then we do have a workload cap there, and we would not represent with one lawyer more than 10 people at a time on a particular docket.
So Martesha, let me stop you for a second. Go back, just for people who don't know, a B and C misdemeanor, what would that be for people who don't know what they are?
So a C misdemeanor is the very lowest level. It carries up to 30 days. That's something like a disorderly conduct, a criminal trespass. That is the lowest level misdemeanor we have in the state of Tennessee. B misdemeanor is a little more serious. It carries up to 6 months. That's things like reckless driving, resisting arrest. Those are your B misdemeanors. There is a B misdemeanor level of assault. So that is an assault that is more just an offensive contact. Classic example of that is spitting on someone, which is considered offensive, but doesn't necessarily rise to the level of the bodily injury component required for a Class A misdemeanor level assault. And so those are three layers of misdemeanor cases. On the converse of that, in the felony spectrum, you have from Class E felony, which is the lowest level felony, up to Class A, which is the most serious, and then murder charges, they carry an automatic life sentence if convicted, death sentence if that is sought by the state, or life without parole. That's sort of what that is. And we can talk about what each level of those felonies are, but I think it's just important to know that they rise in level of seriousness from E to A, and then your murder cases are the most serious charges that we have. So if you have a misdemeanor day, that's what you're doing. You're going to one of those dockets. You know who you're going to be representing in the morning. If you have a client that has been on bond, you have developed a relationship with them, you've interviewed them, you've begun investigating those cases, and you are ready to have a negotiation with the DA or a bench trial if that is what the client wants to do, or a preliminary hearing that will allow the case to go to the criminal court where you can have a jury trial. The jail dockets are a little trickier because, as I stated, we're representing people who've been arrested within a 24-hour time frame. And so we are oftentimes meeting those clients very soon after they have been arrested, and we're going to court with them. Those dockets, I think, are the most difficult docket for someone to work as a lawyer in our office, because it's where we see the most tragedy. We see in those cases people who've been arrested, and there's really not a whole lot that we can do when we just meet them. They go to court on a docket and they receive an offer to plead guilty, and oftentimes they take those offers. And so that can be very challenging. That's where you encounter a lot of people with mental health disorders, addictions, people who are experiencing homelessness. And if you are tasked with working what we call the initial appearance or the review docket for people who have been recently arrested, that can be the most difficult docket to work. We have that same docket in the felony structure. However, those cases, we don't go to court until 48 hours has passed. So that gives us time in a serious felony case. If we know that we've got a client who's been charged with homicide, we immediately get to the jail. We immediately get an investigator worked into that matter. We look to see if there is a forensic mental health evaluation that is necessary. And we have a little bit more time. Now, 48 hours is not a lot of time, but we have a little bit more time to prepare for that case for its first court appearance. So general sessions is very fast paced. It rotates all the time. Those 11 judges and 11 personalities are rotating in and out. And so that day is it depends. In criminal court, you could be having a jury trial on a particular day. If you have a case that is set for jury trial, you could be preparing to go to trial on a Monday. Well, that's before COVID. Now we're kind of not having jury trials until we figure out how we're going to be able to do that and maintain a level of social distancing and health considerations. The other weekly dockets in criminal court are basically your discussions where you're talking with the DA about trying to negotiate settlements in your felony, more serious cases, or you have a motions docket for people who you represent on probation violations where they've already been placed on probation and now there is an allegation that they've violated that in some way, or you have filed some motion to exclude evidence, suppress evidence, motion to dismiss the matter. And so that's just what it looks like. Criminal court is more of a slower pace because of the types of cases that exist there, but your relationships last longer. So you could have a client that you're representing in criminal court for several years. When I was practicing there, some of my clients who were charged with very serious homicides, I represented them for some at a minimum 2 years. It can be longer than that though. It just takes that type of time. And so it depends. The stakes are higher though in criminal court. And so that day is it's different, but the emotions are different. And then all of our supportive teams, their day it just depends. Investigators are in the field, they're interviewing witnesses, they're tracking down evidence for us, they are going to get video and trying to catch a scene while it's still active. Our social services and client advocate team are trying to help us prepare release plans and social history and gather educational evidence, because the real goal for us at the public defender's office is to still provide excellent representation to our clients, even though they can't afford to pay us, and that is a big distinction. They deserve the very best of our representation, regardless of their financial limitations in their case.
Well, fascinating. And I've seen some of that work. And it's just amazing how quickly some of it goes, and the amount of effort, particularly from your office, that goes into trying to make this all work. Let me ask you a question in terms of a typical, when people go over for the jail docket, people have been incarcerated for maybe 24 hours. How many people are coming through the system at that point? What's a typical number of people? And then I got a follow-up after that.
It depends. Yeah. The COVID pandemic has reduced those numbers significantly, and I think it's a combination of the arrests are down, citations are being given in more instances, but I think also there just isn't the same level of offenses that are being charged right now. But pre-COVID, I think that day could depend. If it's a holiday weekend, you could come in with a very, very thick docket. When I was working, now this is ages ago, but there are times where on a misdemeanor review docket where you're handling all of the B's and C's, you could represent 40, 50 people at a time. One person could do that. Yeah. On the A misdemeanor, there can be a lot of cases on there. We just cap our representation at 10 because we don't think that we can give excellent representation to more than that number of people at a time. And even that can be a stretch at times. So those, they really don't have a cap. It's every single person that is arrested in this city within a 24-hour period or a 48-hour period. And Mondays are typically the heaviest because you have people over the weekend that are going to be catching on that docket. And then once you get to about Wednesday and Thursday, those are the lighter days. It also depends on what's going on in the city. It just can change. Those numbers really do change day to day, week to week.
Okay, so one of the questions that someone had sent in was underlying issue being mental health. So you were talking about particularly, I mean, you were talking about, you know, in some of your more serious cases, you may have a client for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So you get to know them and it's a lot more effort, a lot more time. On that jail docket, it's really quick.
Yes.
And so if the question is underlying issue being mental health, how much of it do you think that's what it is? And what you talked about social workers and other things, obviously it's a quick turnover, but is there some follow-up services that are being provided at that moment, even in a quick turnaround on like a typical jail docket for those misdemeanor cases?
So the dual diagnosis of both mental health and addiction is, I would say, an overwhelming percentage of people who come through the system. Many of the people who we encounter on these jail docket, initial appearance dockets that I'm referring to, you might see them again if they're arrested and they're on your docket on a Monday, it is highly possible that by Wednesday, Thursday of that week, you see the same person again. It is highly likely that from week to week, you see the same individuals come through the system. We have sort of a rolling list of people who have been declared incompetent and never to be competent again by the doctors at Vanderbilt when they've been evaluated, yet sometimes they are still arrested and brought into our system. Mental health is one of the biggest sort of underlying unaddressed issues that contribute to people being brought into the system. And I think it is significant. There are a lot of people who come into the system and have a mental health flag. And I know that's one of the things that we've talked about several times. The sheriff has talked about it many times as well, with trying to figure out how we do something different in those cases. It is also difficult to find services. So resources are a problem. If you have a client who has severe mental illness, who also is experiencing homelessness, doesn't have insurance, doesn't have the ability to pay anyone for a place to live, then it is very, very difficult to find a mental health resource for someone, particularly in a short turnaround. And so we do the best that we can, but oftentimes you do see people who are mentally ill, and we all know that in the system. And other than, setting them up with mobile crisis at times or to be evaluated by Centerstone, then you're really just sending people back into the streets, being released from custody, and haven't really been able to address their mental health. And it's been a long life, a long history of unaddressed mental illness. And that's across the board. People who are charged with your very lowest level misdemeanor, people who are charged with domestic violence in some instances, or class A misdemeanors. Mental illness is present in a lot of cases, or unaddressed trauma, or unaddressed appropriately addiction issues. It's a big deal. And the lack of resources to help people is, I think, an even bigger deal. So the jail becomes the treatment facility.
All right. So I guess the question, I usually say my bigger questions towards the end just to keep people anticipating, but let's get into that, because I think that is a big issue for people. And that is, so as the public defender, how would you fix that? So if you're seeing the same people come back through the system again and again because of mental health concerns or addiction concerns, and if just the way the system works now, it's, you do the best you can and you try to get people help, but there's limited resources, and you end up seeing the same people over and over again. What would you do if you could? How would you fix that? What would you do?
So I think particularly mental health resource discussions are a part of the conversation when you hear that we need to reimagine public safety and how we operate in the system. For many, many years, and Nashville is not alone in this issue, many years we have treated mental illness by sending people to jail because we don't have anywhere else for them to go. And so we need to really think about what resources are necessary to help people with their underlying issues. We also need to understand that sometimes, a lot of times, it is more than just mental illness. It is mental illness, it is unaddressed trauma, it is addiction. There's so many things that go into that, and there are not enough available spaces for people to go. The mission is a resource, but everybody can't go to the mission. The mission isn't treating people for mental illness. Centerstone and all of these other places are great resources, but they can't help every single person. And there are sometimes some extra layers that keep people from being able to get the assistance that they need. They might be, in some respects, too mentally ill for the resources that we have available currently in Nashville. So if we're talking about prioritizing shifting people from custody who have mental illness and need to be addressing that, then it is about resources into bed space available, into resources that will really help people. And I know one of those resources right now, the sheriff is opening the behavioral care center for people to try and try this model, to try and divert people from the traditional jail trajectory into the behavioral care center, where they will simply address mental illness only and have their cases dismissed, which I think we have gotten into a habit, if I'm being frank about it, as punishing people and allowing people to build criminal records. Like I can see some of my infamous clients, and not infamous because of anything they've done really, but infamous because they come into the docket 2 or 3 times a week. I can see them walking sometimes downtown, and I know that their criminal record is pages and pages and pages of criminal trespass or disorderly conduct, these very low-level misdemeanors that really, they don't have anywhere to go. They are severely mentally ill, and they will never be made competent enough to be able to stand a trial. So in those instances, the question becomes, why do we keep arresting them? What resources are available so that if an officer has to respond to a scenario where one of those persons are involved, we can send them somewhere else other than the jail? Because sending them to jail just holds them for the moment, because they can't physically stand trial. They don't have the mental capacity to do it. So the case will be dismissed. It is about resources. It is about understanding how mental illness works and how it factors into these cases, and trying to get at the root of the issues versus punishing the behavior sometimes, where the behavior is a result of the bigger problem.
Okay, so the sheriff was on well, probably about a month ago, and was talking about this. So obviously, different way of doing it. And I guess from the standpoint of what do you think? I mean, this is one of those things where I assume everybody is sort of working together to figure out who ends up in that new treatment type of facility. What do you think? Obviously, we're going to give it a try and see if it works. So were you involved in some of the discussions about it? Yeah,
I have been involved. We have regular conversations about the sheriff's vision for the behavioral care center. He allows us to be a very vocal part of, what our concerns might be, how we best service people. And I think he's made the space available for, sometimes for me to be frank about, I think some of the criticism might initially be that the behavioral care center is attached to this jail here. And so how do we distinguish the two? And so I think that will just come with, once we start to actually send people there, which we will be a part of. Our office will actually staff a behavioral care component where we'll be looking at people on those initial jail dockets to see if they can be diverted into the behavioral care center. And any resource that is available to keep people from getting convictions when we could do something else with them, we are a fan of that. We are a proponent of that. And so we have been glad to be a part of those discussions and really ready to see whether this is something that can work. And then we can start to try and expand that to other areas where we might be able to do things differently than how we've always done them. And I think this has been a very vocal proponent of not continuing the same cycles surrounding mental health, where traditionally we either let them back out, we put them on probation and pretty much set them up for failure because they can't really comply with the terms of those probations. And so I think it's an opportunity for all of us to try and do this differently. And so, yes, we've been a part of those discussions with the sheriff's office.
Okay, good. Let me switch course for just a minute. Tell me a little bit more about juvenile and what happens there, and how does your office engage in that way?
We have a team down over our office on the juvenile side is actually in the Juvenile Justice Center. So we have an office over there, and we have a team of lawyers, 3 lawyers, a client advocate, and a social services provider there And also we have an education rights division that helps students actually in Metro Nashville Public Schools who have some educational plan that needs to be enacted and may find themselves either in trouble, been suspended, or they're in trouble, and we go into the metro schools and represent those kids through our education rights program. And our juvenile team represents people on detention dockets. We have a guardian ad litem. We represent kids who have they've been charged with detention related offenses, and we go and staff those dockets. We try to get kids out. We represent them the same way in which we do on the adult side. And if we have a serious case where a juvenile is charged with an offense and the state is seeking to transfer them, then we send a team from our adult division and our juvenile division to go in and work those together. And we try and advocate for the juvenile court judge to not transfer those cases to the adult system if at all possible.
Okay, so let me ask you about, because I think particularly from a juvenile standpoint and getting social services and maybe the right resources in, how many staff people do you have that actually focus on that? Not your attorneys, but the social services aspect of it.
On our juvenile side, we have 2 client advocates, or a client advocate and a social worker that are helping our 3 attorneys there. And then we do have client advocate that works with our education rights team as well. So a total of 3 that help with the attorneys who are staffing all of what we do in the juvenile space. Okay,
so here's a softball question for you. Could you use more help down at juvenile?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I could use more help. So if we're talking about, I think that, and this is something that, I'm a year and a half into this position, but it's certainly something that I have been working towards being able to build these discussions when we start to talk about budgeting and resources, that if you are able to fully focus on social services and we have fully staffed investigators, we are able to get better results. And those better results equal less jail time, which for us means that a person is not in a cage, in a physical cage, and it reduces the time they're in custody. But for people like yourself and people on the council and people who are dealing with resources, that equals less resources that are needed to pay for that person's physical stay in jail. And so we certainly believe that with the ability to find releasing plans for people and the ability to get social services involved and client advocates involved in those cases, we're able to get better results, and better results equals less time in jail for folks. And so, yes, resources we certainly need.
So would you be willing, and here's another softball question for you. So, from the council standpoint, we just passed the budget the other night, okay? A lot of stress, a lot of pressure, a lot of stuff in the paper still, and it'll be going on for a while. But I'm a big advocate in that the budget is a year-round thing, not just how we do it, and once you pass it, it's operational. I get that. But I'm a big fan of saying, why don't we wait until February, March, April to start talking about it? Why don't we talk about it now? So some of the ideas that you're sending out are really important to know. And so I guess one of the questions would be, would you and your staff, and we'd obviously, want to include the DA's office because they have other interests as well, and the sheriff's office, but particularly from your standpoint, sitting down earlier than waiting until February and talking about reforms in your system so we can actually start working on that. Would you be interested in doing that?
Absolutely. And as a part of our performance metrics that we submitted this year with our budget discussions, we sort of thought about a different way of thinking about performance related things as it relates to the public defender's office. So this year, some of our performance metrics are including a social services or client advocate into a case. And what we hope to be able to gauge from our performance metrics are we, one, able to actually put those services with all of our cases? And I bet what we're going to find is that answer is no. I just don't have enough of them. Right. But in cases where we are able to plug in a social services component or an investigator, and we're really able to build the entire casework that we want to be able to build, are our results better? And if so, then those are the types of discussions that we do plan to be having with the council and our budget and analysts going forward. That this is how we see reform. This is how we are gauging our performance. And so if we want to be able to keep doing this, we need more resources in these areas. So I think, yes, we'd certainly be happy to have those discussions before March of next year.
Yeah, I mean, you can go look back on this budget, and for people who've been watching this show, I mean, this budget was, you know, I used to call it a status quo budget. It was because of the COVID, the 19 situation, the pandemic. You know, the city was financially stressed, had to get back even. The comptroller's office, who was on here last week, was saying that we had to get our fund balances back up. So there was a lot of stress to try to get the budget back together. The budget's passed, okay? So we're holding it together. We'll see what happens with the pandemic. But it always seemed to me that we needed to be talking about these issues well in advance of next year to really get a better sense of what really we should be changing in that budget when we have the opportunity. This was not necessarily the best budget to be looking for opportunities because, you know, we were just trying to hold it together. But I'd love to take you up on the offer and start working on it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a couple of things, couple of questions that people have got. Restoration of voting rights. So is your office engaged in that, and how is that going, if they are, or who's actually working on that?
So we assist our clients, so clients of our office, with any of their post-judgment needs. So if they have a situation where they are trying to get their voting rights restored and they were our client, yes, we help them with those matters. And it is a process. Essentially, it means looking at whether they have completed all of the components of whatever their release was, all of their probation or parole, all of that is done. They have paid all of the fees associated with that offense. Or if they haven't paid them and they are indigent, then we are advocating for them to be declared indigent and get those fees waived by a court. And then just making sure they know the appropriate paperwork that needs to be filled out, the certifications that have to happen, and where it all needs to go to get those voting rights restored. So we do a wide variety of post-judgment representation for clients of the Public Defender's Office. And that's any of our lawyers who have represented somebody in a case.
Okay, all right, thank you. Another question, just overall about the bail system. Maybe a quick explanation.
Talk about this all day.
I know. What about, give everybody kind of a quick explanation of how it works now. And okay. then I will let you go on for I do have another question behind it, but tell me how you'd fix it. All right, so tell everybody how it works now, and then tell me what you think about it and what you'd like to see happen with it.
If you are arrested and charged with a crime in Nashville, then you will see a commissioner or magistrate judge who will set a bail in your case. All cases, the majority of them, have bail set in them. Everybody has a right to bail. So you have the right to go before a judge, and a judge sets a bail amount. Now, the issue with that is, oftentimes that means to secure your release before your trial date or your first court date, you must pay a bail bondsman or a cash bail to be released from custody. And so for my life, for the public defender, and for all of my clients who are already marginalized in some way, already experiencing poverty, or they don't have money, then the issue becomes wealth-based detention. So that is where you start to see these discussions about the bail system. If you have the money to pay your bail that's been set in your case, you go pay it. You get out, you continue with your life, you prepare your case for however you want it to proceed in the process, and you don't have to worry about the pressures of being in custody. If you don't have money, no matter how small it is, $3,000 bail would only require $300 to be given to a bail bondsman to get out, or $3,000 of a cash bond. If you don't have that money and you can't afford it and you aren't eligible for a pretrial release or a judge has not released you ROR, and those are ROR release is a very rare form of release, then you are stuck in custody. And the significance of that is being stuck in custody means that any moment, any minute, any day you're there, you could lose anything. You could lose everything. For my clients, a day in custody, 2 days in custody, a week in custody, oftentimes means they've lost everything. They're already living sometimes week to week or day to day in places where they live. And so they're in custody, they're working jobs where they're using a temp agency, or they're jobs that can afford for them to be gone for a couple of days and hold that job for them. So they've lost the place they live. Their clothes or the stuff that they've earned or they have is placed on the street somewhere. They lose their jobs. They lose their hope, which is a very important thing. And then they become incredibly driven by how fast can I get out of jail? And they're not driven by you have the right to a trial by jury. You have the right to make the state prove whatever it is you're charged with. Just because you're charged don't mean you're guilty. The state has to prove it. But what you get into what you get into when somebody is stuck in the pressure of I can't get out of jail. I will be in jail until my case is done. And you just heard me earlier say sometimes these cases can go through the system for years. So if you have that pressure over you, then a lot of times, a lot of my clients become driven solely by how quickly can you get me out of jail? And they are willing to take a plea offer to get out of jail. And that's what's driving them versus trying to exercise those rights. And so we really have to get in discussion about the Constitution guarantees people a lot of rights, but we're eroding them in several ways with our bail system, with the way in which we do things that actually has many of my clients believing that they are presumed guilty versus presumed innocent. Because if you're presumed innocent, then it shouldn't feel like everything in the system is designed or feels like an area for you to be presumed guilty. You come into jail, you're in jail, and it just seems like you're trying to pull yourself out of this cycle. And once you get involved in the criminal justice system, it is incredibly hard to pull yourself out of a cycle. And so anytime we get on the soapbox of people like myself who say we have to be doing things differently, setting a cash bail amount cannot continue to be the end all be all because there is such a disparity there. People automatically come back to me and they say, well, we got to think about public safety. We can't just let people be released from jail and back into these communities where they could reoffend or something happen. And I often say to people, you don't consider that the same way if they have money. If a person is charged with homicide and they have the $1 million to post their bail and they post it, those same arguments don't exist about them coming back to their communities. It is, if we're talking about letting somebody out of custody without them paying money, and no part of our system should be based on how much money a person has. And so that is the core conversation around bail. And you asked a great question when you said, well, what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. And that is the conversation that I think is a difficult one. I'm going to be honest. I'm a lawyer, and I'm also pretty passionate about the fact that the bail system is not working well. But I am not going to ever come out and say that I am a proponent for a total proponent of what some of the alternatives are. So one of the alternatives is that we establish these risk assessment tools. And basically every person who comes into custody, they're put into these computer-like formulas, and the risk assessment tool just sort of outlines whether they are high risk, medium risk, low risk, and if they are in one of these categories, they are automatically released. Well, that sounds like a good idea, except computer-based programs are built by people. And so some of the biases that exist in the criminal justice system exist in those programs as well. And so there isn't a foolproof answer to this, but I am a proponent of us trying to find community-based alternatives, resource-based alternatives to get people to come to court. So if they get released and they don't have a phone, can we figure out a way to get that person a phone? Or if they have a cell phone, and can we text them when their next court date is? Can we set up some community-based things that help people navigate the criminal justice system? And I think, you know, what we've been seeing with the community bail fund and through this COVID era, there have been an increase in the number of people who have been released on pretrial. And what you're finding is they're being released and their return to court rate is still good. You're not having an increase of the number of people who are failing to appear in court. And so if that is true and that is the case, then we need to start looking at this differently so that our detention is not wealth-based, because it always affects my clients negatively.
So let me ask you a question. There are other states and other places that don't use bail, correct?
Yes.
All right. So if people who are watching today wanted to take a good look at a system, a different system, you got one in mind that we should take a look at? I know you're not advocating.
I got to take the word good out of it. We have to, there's not a good look at none of these other alternatives are great ones. I mean, they are better, but they're not great. So I would tell you that you could look at California's system because I think it gives you a full picture of how the advocates advocated for a different method of cash bail. And then that happened, but then what was implemented in some respects is more harsh than what was there before. So looking at that being an example of they did a different thing, but that thing wasn't great. And I can drop some, I don't know how you do these later, but I could maybe drop some resources to put that in with when you send the video out for other of how they do the bail system differently. Because you're right, some places don't have a cash bail system. Now that does mean sometimes people are just detained before their court date.
Yeah, if you'll send the resources over to me, then we'll drop them in. So let me ask you another question. Somebody asked me a question about who sets the bond. It's a magistrate, and
yes, for the most part a magistrate, but all of the judges have the ability. So a magistrate sets it for these people that we've been talking about that get arrested within 24 or 48 hours, and then the magistrate, after that, when they appear on the actual jail docket, you can address bond with either the general sessions judge or the criminal court judge. You can address bond again in those scenarios. Right. And those judges have the ability to do something with the bond. If the case is just a grand jury indictment, and what that means is the district attorney's office has sent a case to the grand jury for review, that is a secret proceeding, my office is not involved in that process, then the bail amount is set already on that grand jury indictment when it comes out of the grand jury, if that makes sense.
So let me ask you this. Is there kind of a range for a bond based upon the nature of the misdemeanor or the felony? You know,
the statute,
yeah, go ahead.
The statute does make some recommendations regarding the bond amount level. But one of the biggest issues I think with our system is we are not analyzing the ability to pay. And I think that is one of the critical components here in considering bail. You have to consider whether the amount is excessive. You have to consider the person's ability to pay, what they might be able to pay, as a consideration in the complete picture of setting bail. And therein, I think, is where we have difficulty. They don't have for whatever reason, we are not addressing ability to pay when we're making a bail determination. We
got a lot of work to do, don't we? There's a lot of things that need not a thing.
Yes.
Okay. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Okay.
Okay.
This has been really, it's fascinating. All right. So this was my big question to you. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on all over the country. In Nashville, you've got the council was just dealing with the police issue. There were people calling for it to be defunded. Then there were questions about we need to give them more resources. There's all kinds of differing opinions going on. It's a good, it's a difficult time, but it's also a good time. It's a good time for people to they're expressing their opinions, which is a good thing. So tell me from your standpoint as the public defender in Davidson County, things that you would recommend that needed to be reformed in our system, whether it's with the police or with our legal system. You've talked about the bail system. You've talked about mental health. What do you think, where do you think we should go? And I'm not sure, I'm not asking you, for you know, I want this and this and this, and you may want that, but there needs to be focus and discussion on these things. And so I guess what I'm looking for is, where would you tell us to head if we were going to fix some of these things that people are so concerned about? Where do we need to start focusing in on?
Well, so I said at the beginning of my remarks that I love Nashville, and that goes without saying. I love this city, but we have our share of issues. And I think what we are seeing, not only in our city right now, but what we're seeing across the country, is people who have reached the boiling point of feeling like they are unheard and that their needs are not an important priority to the people in power in their particular cities or our national government. And so I think that is a critical component of what we all need to return to. We are all elected officials. All of us who are in these positions, we need to be mindful of who we answer to. But not just that, not just be mindful that we answer to our constituents, but be mindful of the people who are affected the most by these issues. So when we talk about policing, you got to think about the communities who are policed the most, who have dealt with over-policing. You have to think about my client population, who I can't tell you how many countless times I've asked a client of mine why they just agreed to a search of their car or their home. And they say, I don't have a choice. I don't have a choice. My rights don't matter in my neighborhood or in my community. And you hear these same conversations about, you know, our grassroots agencies who talked about driving while Black and talked about the disparities in our criminal justice system. And I think you have really reached a place where people are tired of having the same discussion. They're tired of feeling like they are not listened to. And so if I were making suggestions about that, I would say we better stop talking and having these same conversations, and we better actually start listening to people. We better actually figure out, you know, there is a saying about, you know, you put your resources show where your heart lies, or something like that, right? And so if we are a heart for the people, then our resources need to reflect that. We can't continue to pull resources from all of these things that contribute to the criminal justice system. So I'm speaking solely about the criminal justice system. Education, mental health, addiction, poverty, affordable housing, all of those things contribute to the bucket that could lead somebody to the criminal justice system. If you don't appropriately resource education, and there are large disparities between education in a poor neighborhood and education in a more wealthy neighborhood, I bet you, I know this for a fact, the school to prison pipeline in those areas that are under-resourced is more prevalent. If you have pockets, we can't ignore that 37208 was the highest in the nation of incarceration. And there are factors that contributed to that. And so these huge disparities, our city and our leaders need to start to think about the crux and the core of how we got to these places, and we need to fix that. And we need to not look at the folks who are making their voices heard at this point as just, you know, they're just complaining or they just don't understand, because that's not true. They live in these areas, they live in this moment, and they are tired of business as usual about these things. And you know, I understand that frustration. I see day in and day out the disparities in the criminal justice system and how difficult it is once you get caught up in it to get out of it. And these things affect somebody for the rest of their life. It's generational. The trauma that exists is just, I mean, I could just go on and on and on. It benefits us as a people to stop saying we need to have conversations. I'm so tired of the word conversation right now, because we have, let's just talk about policing. We've been having conversations. We've had conversations for as many mayors as I can count from when I have done this job. I've been in the public defender's office for 11 years. We have had conversations. We have had race conversations. We have had policing discussions. We are tired of conversations. We need people to understand that folks are not just complaining about the police. And to talk about resources does not mean you are anti-police. to say that we need to feel as strongly about education and as strongly about all of these other things does not mean you are anti the police department. Even as a public defender, people often think that that means I'm such a zealot that I just don't think the police are necessary at all. That's not true at all. But I do know that there are many, many things in this city that are equally important. We cannot continue to ignore that it is not affordable to live in this city. And the people that are feeling that the most are your historic Black and minority communities. The people who are sitting in jail the most are your Black and minority communities. The school systems that are affected the most in a poor way are your Black and minority communities. And so, if this city is really going to be a city for all of us, then we have to be upfront and discuss the fact that we have not been well to our Black and minority communities. We have to own that. And we also need to own that all of these systems, if we're being honest about it, particularly the criminal justice system, has some deep-seated roots in racism. And so our city, if we're having conversations, they need to be honest. And we need to move out of the conversational phase into a future of action. And that action is important, but it can't include the players that have been invited to the table for so long. We need to have some new voices and new people who are at these tables to talk about it. And they need to actually be heard. It's one thing to say we're going to have a focus group on who, or whatever it's going to be called, to hire a new police chief, if when we bring those people in, they're really not listened to. If we're gonna be transparent, accountable, and actually inclusive, then we really have to do that. And I can soapbox all day about it. But
no, you can keep going.
This is where we are.
I think
I do see a question in the chat over here that I think is an important one to talk about. If you don't mind me answering that.
No, that's fine. Which one is it?
Like a speed answer.
All right, go ahead.
I see someone ask about the breakdown of the arrest system. Where can you find this hierarchy published? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of educational resources available. We do have in our office a resource called Take This Book that explains the criminal justice system from beginning to end, from arrest to trial, and has some other details therein. So if you will email me, and my email address is on our Nashville Defenders website, I will email you a copy of Take This Book that breaks down to you the hierarchy from arrest to trial. How often are persons charged with nonviolent offenses released without bond? The pretrial releases have gone up substantially during this time, this COVID era. A lot of people who are just charged with a misdemeanor, nonviolent offense, they are being released on pretrial. I believe that as many people that we can safely release into the community so that they can have equal footing in prepping their case for trial, I think we should prioritize doing that. There is a question here about the motion I filed related to COVID-19 and the request to release people. The question is, were there individuals negatively impacted by COVID-19? I would say absolutely. Though the sheriff's department only has had, I believe it's 20 positive cases total, and all of those people have recovered. What you have to understand is that there is a cycle involved in that. If any person tests positive or is experiencing symptoms, then the entire pod goes on quarantine. And that means they don't have access to their families, they don't have visitation. We can't even go over and see them. We have to video with them. They can't come to court. So at any given time, there have been times where there have been over 100 people on quarantine because someone has tested positive. The other negative impact is just the complete fear of whether you're going to contract this virus in this jail, and whether it might be a death sentence for you, and whether or not what you are charged with warrants all of that. So that, I think, is the negative piece about COVID. Let's see. Eliminating bail for all but the most serious crimes. I think we kind of talked about that.
Mm-hmm. I think we got most of them.
Yeah, we talked about that. I think privatized prison is just, it's a troubling scenario. And it is difficult I mean, some of what we've seen just in light of COVID with the privatized prisons and how COVID has run rampant through those facilities shows just some of the problem with having a privatized system. So, yeah.
There was one question that just came in, and that's about trials being delayed because of COVID-19, how long they're being delayed for. Do you have any idea of what it looks like in the future?
At least delayed through July, but I think conversations are starting to happen about how you have a jury trial post-COVID. I think from a practitioner's perspective, I am going to be concerned as we prepare to go back to jury trial with what are our jurors concerned with when they come into the courthouse. Because I need a juror who is completely devoted to learning about the trial before them and not worried about contracting COVID. Rightfully so, they will be concerned about that. But we have to think about that. We have to think about witnesses who testify with a mask on, because if my whole face is completely covered, you don't get to gauge my facial expressions, my responses to questions, and all of that stuff goes towards the veracity of a witness. So I think there's a lot that will go into us returning to having jury trials, and certainly the people who are in custody right now waiting for their trial date, their life has just been delayed.
Yeah.
Somebody asked a question about monitoring magistrates. Those magistrates are monitored by the elected general sessions judges. And so the magistrates are not elected, but the general sessions judges are, and they monitor the magistrates who are just regular employees of Metro.
Well, Martesha, it's 11 o'clock.
Yes.
I am fascinated by this conversation. I am so happy that you agreed to come on and talk frankly. I'm thinking about a lot of things. I'm rethinking some of the way that we've tried to do stuff. I've got with the budget stuff over with the council, at least for now. We have a period of time where we kind of get back together and then head into the next year. There is so many things that are issues that we need to deal with, including from a budgetary standpoint. And I love the concept. We've tried to deal with this thing of, I'm tired of conversations as well. We need to take action. And sometimes that's the most difficult part, you know, it's because we've tried to do that, and then you get to recommendations and somehow they just don't get done. So now we have to kind of flip that. I'm also a big believer in listening to bringing new people into the system because, you know, somebody once said that, you know, you can't rely on the people that created the problems to then solve the problems. And that's what happens sometimes when you have people in office for like 40, 50 years. They're trying to solve the problems that they actually created. You got to bring fresh faces and new ideas and new concepts, and then you got to see what you can implement. I got a lot of things to think about.
You got to be okay with being uncomfortable, because some of what you're going to hear when you bring those people to the table is some uncomfortable, they're going to be upset. And you have to be willing to settle in that uncomfortableness and accept what is being said to you.
I understand. I appreciate everything you've said. Thank you for being my guest.
Yes, thank you for having me.
This has been great. We have Abby Rubenfeld next week, so people
Awesome.
can turn in. And I will tell you, the last thing I've got is my a good friend, Pastor Fuzz, is back in the hospital. My thoughts are with him. He reminded me that people need to be donating to the food project over at General Hospital. They're trying to raise money to give out food to families that are in need. And that's what Pastor Fuzz, who is, we're hoping he gets through this. It's not COVID, it's something else. He's fighting through this, and I really think about him quite a bit. But he wants people to donate to the food project at General Hospital, so I'm just reminding people. Martesha, have a great rest of the weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you again, and thanks everybody. Have a good weekend. Thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.